Welcome to the 19th episode of Experts Dispatch. Today we have Dr. Feroz Hassan Khan Saab with us. Feroz Hassan Khan Saab is a research professor at the US Naval Postgraduate School. A former brigadier in the Pakistan Army, he served as Director of Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs in the Pakistan Strategic Plans Division. Pakistan in several multilateral forums and has published on Pakistan security policies and strategic stability in South Asia, including Eating Grass, The Making of the Pakistani Bomb, and his latest book, Subcontinent Adrift Strategic Futures of South Asia. Thank you, sir, for being a part of this podcast. So, the first question: do you think numbers of nuclear weapons matters when it comes to nuclear deterrence? Does it affect the likelihood of state achieving its political goals uh, in a crisis situation?
Well, thank you for the question. This has been a major question throughout the nuclear age. The lesson that we have learned from the Cold War was that in the bipolar contest, each country kept on piling up nuclear weapons, piling up thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons. That, if you go by that argument, then the numbers do matter to that extent. But how much is enough? That's been the question always asked. And the manner in which the Cold War, they used to have start calculating in a very mathematical way called the drawdown curves, that if such and such weapon will be destroyed, numbers, how much will be the residual numbers left. So when the deterrence theory began, in the sense that can you absorb a first strike and then retaliate and give unacceptable punishment to your adversary, the numbers game became more important. But the second part of your question is about, does it, fulfill the political objectives? That's what your question is, right?
Yes.
That's where the subject of number game actually comes, because you have to define what your political objectives are and what is the purpose of nuclear weapons in your political aims and objectives, national aims and objectives, and the role nuclear weapons will play in your national security policy. Each country differs from different way. Now, if you're going and again talking about World War, China was one country that began something called the minimal deterrence, and that they say the numbers don't matter. It is enough that I have nuclear weapons to retaliate, and I will prevent from an arms race. So that's the minimum deterrence concept that came from China at the time when there was a bipolar context, indicated that numbers do matter, but numbers keep on increasing, numbers do not matter. That takes away your resources, that takes away, in a very simplified, in a crude form, like you say, if it is a recipe that makes it just right, then adding more spice doesn't make it more tasty. Sometimes people say in that way. So how much is enough is always the case that every state determines, and how the state qualifies its national security policies. So there's no right or yes or no answer to the question. If you're asking my question is that by simply continuing to increase the number of nuclear weapons may not necessarily provide you more security. You have to figure out that nuclear deterrence does not just gets complete with the name of number alone, but there are multiple factors in delivery systems, how you intend to integrate it with conventional forces, how command systems are evolved, and how technology changes. So these all factors actually contribute towards overall deterrence posture. So in that sense, numbers have limit. Numbers then a certain point comes and numbers don't matter. Some authors even think that it has diminishing returns, that you keep on adding, it doesn't matter anymore further. So because the more the nuclear weapons, the more the management issues, the more storage sites, the more elements, the more delivery means, how long, how much is enough. So that question continues to evade. and then it's just become something, an unending chase, And that's what we learned from the war, from the Cold War. And eventually, when the detente happened, and then subsequently they went through cutting down to START treaties, and then the Cold War ended. So now you're cutting down. So if you're looking at that history, then you would probably say that, come on, there's a limit to everything. Yeah.
So another debate, specifically as student of strategic studies, we see that there are multiple frameworks that exist to make sense of deterrent relationships between uh, adversarial nuclear powers. And these frameworks include, for example, pentapolar system, a tetraplex system, the system when you look at nuclear powers from the triad equation and from a dyadic equation. In your opinion, uh, what sort of framework is more appropriate to make sense of nuclear deterrent relationship? Should it be this? Should it be the frameworks known as pentapolar, tetraplex, or triad that look at nuclear deterrent equation, from a strategic chain perspective, from a cascading effect, complexity, and interdependence perspective, or you feel that a dyadic relationship is more appropriate to make sense of nuclear deterrence between two nuclear power states?
Yeah, I mean, again, your question has so many inbuilt wheels within wheels. The way you can define in any way you want to define. I mean, your question began with sort of a geometric way of defining. Pentagon means 5 sets or subsets, and then you say tetra means 4, and then triad 3. So you can always define. You see, the way the nuclear age evolved, essentially very quickly it became into a bipolar context, which was essentially you might call it a system level, international, global level dyadic system, where alliance politics, extended deterrence, created two sort of major camps of deterrence. Even at that time, when China became the third power, there were more nuclear weapons power, even during the first nuclear age. But then again, the geopolitics matters a lot. Very quickly, China and Russia became separate entities, and then China sort of became an ally after Nixon's argument. So it was dyadic at the system level. If you come to think about it, France, etc., they're part of the NATO. So we only knew how two-sided deterrence works. It was after post-Cold War when for a long time, there was a unipolar moment. But that's where the thing started changing, because the nuclear weapons deterrence equation started moving from the global bipolar context towards the regional ones in the 1990s. That's where Middle East and South Korea, India, Pakistan actually began. And those contexts were essentially very regional, very compact. That's very different than what was evolved during the Cold War, but there was distances involved, except for Europe, where you had East-West deployment. Essentially, it was the US and Russia were distant. So that did not evolve in a very compact regional way. So now this kind of definition, that the way you are defining tetra or pentagon or trilateral, this is of late. I mean, things have been the same, but geography has not changed. It's just the politics that has changed. So the more common term used is either strategic chain or a cascading effect, that one power pushes the other one, because now the world changed after that. China is no longer a sort of partner of the US to destroy Soviet Union. China itself is a peer competitor, and Russia has research which had gone back into sort of out of not being a major power for after Cold War, started resurging back. So why this question is asked, because in the last decade or so, we have seen the rise of China and China's power projection in a very different model, and Russia's resurgence under Putin, and then the manner in which the US confronted these two powers became. So now we have It's more in the era of great power competition. So we call it more of a strategic chain that, is particularly reflecting Pakistan, that it's US affecting China, and China builds up the arsenal, and then China's arsenal, affects India. If India's arsenal affect Pakistan, you can define it in chain. You can define it as security dilemma, that one state builds a weapon for its security purposes, threatens another, and then another builds up, threatens back. So we get into this chain, we get into this cycle, arms race and disarmament. So you can define it in any shape and form. As end of the day, uh, uh, to me, especially when you're speaking about weaker country, who's at the end of the chain, especially when you're relating to the case of Pakistan, the issue of direct deterrence becomes much more relevant in terms of translating this theoretical concept into real operational deterrent process. That's where the big picture doesn't come in a way that we think so. I mean, we can theoretically talk about it, but that's what affects. So if you're asking my question, it is what affects you requires a response. What doesn't affect you, when you start getting into that big power game, you can define it theoretically, but in terms of practicality, it doesn't really matter much. What matters is immediately what affects you. And then it goes back to the first question again. What is the state objective that nuclear weapons are providing? No matter what change you may say, that's what matters. You're deterring what? You're deterring who? And how you're deterring. That's what matters at the end of the day. So you use the word trilateral. That's a very common term that's being used these days. And
Right.
that is triad indication that. And I've written a lot on trilateralism. You can always search for that. That relates to China, India, Pakistan, usually. And then is this confluence whether China is a global power playing a role at the system level, but the rivalry between India and China is a very regional one. So you can say India is trying to be a competitor to China, peer competitor to China, and China is getting a peer competitor to the US. So at one level, you're trying to be doing the competition at the system level. But at the problem of areas where your conflict is like is a very regional border, cross-border issue. In both cases of China, India, Pakistan. And the nature of relationship between China and Pakistan and China and India is very nuanced too. Very different relationship. So it can be politically defined as a sort of a relationship, but if you look into cross-border issues, they are very, very dyadic. So we are essentially dealing with two asymmetric dyads in interaction with each other that form the triangle of sorts, when it comes to really defining the regional dynamics. And because these are the security dynamics, and each of these countries have a nuclear weapons as a role to play in the national security, and each country defines it differently, where the doctrines actually started mattering a lot. And therefore, in that sense, it is easier to unpack it rather than complicate it by making a dyadic relationship.
Oh,
So that's my view.
okay. So you said, if you look at it from at South Asia, from a South Asian perspective, if you look at deterrence, Pakistan, India, China, and we look at it from two asymmetric dyadic perspective, that will be more appropriate rather than looking.
That's more appropriate for your analysis. I mean, geography won't change. You can define it any way you like, but the purpose is why are we talking about this? We're talking about what course of action we're going to take. That's what matters to us. What affects us? How do we respond? That way, I mean, you can talk theoretically about how do you respond to that. I mean, are you saying that I'm a system player, so I should start targeting what everywhere in the world, or what affects me? So, in that sense, again, for example, India wants to be a player at the system level. So when it builds up arsenals, which are ICBMs and all, it is playing a different game. For the sake of Pakistan, are you playing that game? Do you need ICBMs? So, I mean, if you're grading, then you're manufacturing a sort of a crisis to yourself, which was probably not affecting you directly. So, in that sense, from that standpoint, got to look at the problem more radically rather than trying to look at the effect of that. The cascading effect is the effect that is created. I'm talking in terms of response. So yeah, you can analyze if you want to do that, but will that help? I don't see that helping because history tells you that when smaller countries become pawns in the big chess game of great power politics, it's always the smaller country that suffers.
So when you look at the literature, the nuclear literature that came out in the Cold War era, we see that there was the assumptions used to be challenged about the credibility of nuclear deterrence, for example. But when you look at it as a Pakistani, if you study deterrence, there is a sense that the nuclear deterrence is infallible. And particularly, we see it in the last 20 years that this discourse that is permeated from top to bottom is that the nuclear deterrence would remain intact. What is your take on this? Do you think that the nuclear deterrence is infallible, or it may end up failing someday?
I think the way you frame the question about fallibility of deterrence, etc., it's been always, I mean, you began by saying that it was challenged, the credibility of deterrence was challenged. Look, I mean, this is the history of human technology and war, that every time you built a certain technology and you think this is infallible, it remains infallible for a while and then countervailing strategies are found. So nothing remains infallible from that standpoint. But if you're talking purely about the nuclear age as we speak now, it's this the two ages, or some people call it three ages. There has been this consistent theme of reliance on nuclear deterrence as part of national security policies. At least those weapon states who have actually gone this pathway, you might call it 9 or 10 states, whichever way you want to define. Those countries define nuclear weapons deterrence. And I don't see that those countries are changing that. At some moment they began to change. They thought this is no, we should not have the salience of nuclear weapons in national security policy should reduce, but they actually don't. As we speak now, you can see. So the two different trend lines. We all the time argue that new technological evolution and geopolitics are now, we discussed a little while back, are challenging nuclear deterrence in ways that has never been challenged. So if I put your question the other way around, that how the 20th century deterrence evolved and how the 21st century deterrence applies now, we can say that the 21st century, as the third decade starts, is challenging the way nuclear deterrence was understood in the 20th century. And that is primarily because of geopolitics and the availability of technology. Now, again, that goes back into the history that whether countries change their doctrinal thinking because their old doctrines don't work, and therefore they think new doctrinal changes will actually provide them achieve their national objectives more, and therefore they ask for the new technology. Conversely, the new technology determines that the old doctrines do not understand. So technology drives doctrines rather than doctrine dividing technology. And the history of that is that each country and states differ on that. More commonly, it is the technological evolution or innovation that forces doctrinal changes. Because states don't change doctrine because doctrines become part of inertia of organizations and states. They don't change. They like to continue fighting the World War, and that's what that continues. So in that sense, I would say that nuclear deterrence is fallible, but we don't see any evidence that states have given up their faith in nuclear deterrence. And my own personal view, it is that it can be dented it can be punctured, but it continues to somehow or the other continue to play a role until technological evolution takes it so far that it completely becomes irrelevant. As of now, I would say it has not. Will it remain 50 years from now? Perhaps not. We might find that the speed with which technological shifts are happening, the way deterrence is challenged. There are many factors that are challenging the deterrence. We could talk about that if you wish. So, but those combined factors are the one that are challenging deterrence in ways, and those states who are keeping themselves ahead of the curve will learn how to improve your deterrence postures. But if you continue to harken back to the old theories, you're definitely going to fail because you're not keeping yourself ahead of the curve as to where the world is moving, where technology is moving, and how doctrinal changes are being adjusted. But as we speak now, because we're speaking at a time when there's a Ukraine war that has prolonged for such a long time, that so many theories are overturned about how states with deterrence, coercion, compellence, all these theories are challenged. What was considered to be a limited war has turned out to be a prolonged war. Many people thought nuclear weapons forces you to have very limited conventional operations. It limits them, it constrains them. We see that Ukraine war has gone for such a long time. Now we have a regional war in the Middle East. We are seeing how deterrence is working in extended deterrence and etc. What countries are losing faith in that and trying to get their own technology. In the Far East, for example, Japan and other countries. So if you're looking at the worldwide deterrence changes in deterrence postures happening, you will begin to realize that they are having faith in nuclear deterrence, not losing the salience of nuclear weapons in their national security policy, but at the same time keeping themselves ahead of the curve as to what might change. So, I mean, there's no, again, like I said, your questions do not have a black and white right and no answer. It has a more detailed answers. It's all qualified answers.
Well,
that's what I'm giving you.
So my final question is rooted in contemporary politics and quite simple one. How do you see the de-ratification of CTBT by Russia? How will it affect South Asia?
Yeah, that's a very interesting, and I'm trying to give you a short answer to the question. CTBT evolved immediately after the Cold War ended. And at the time when the CTBT, FMCT, and those arms control, that was an era of arms control that suddenly dawned. Not that era of arms control was not there before era of arms control began in the Cold War. But in the post-Cold War, the era of arms control changed in a certain way. It's a unipolar moment by US-led initiative at the time in the 90s. That's what affected the South Asian region to begin with. CTBT was one tool. So the Fissile Material Cutoff Convention was sort of designed to quantitatively stop, and the CTBT was designed to qualitatively stop because of the weapon system. We know that background, I'll not go well, but that was directly affecting at the time. We know that history did not happen. But we're not seeing the CTBT purely as de-ratification, but if you're looking into the overall spectrum of what has been going on between Russia and the United States. I said earlier that Russia is resurging now. And it was the United States that started getting out of the ABM Treaty and the INF Treaty. Both had different reasons. We'll not get into those reasons. But the fact is that it had to do with the contemporary politics. So we have to link it what is happening now and what's happening now in the Ukraine war. So Russia's withdraw from CTBT now. Test ban, essentially, why do you do the nuclear tests? To validate your designs, to improve the quality. I mean, you have a new weapon system you want to design. That's the purpose. But test in of itself was not just purely validation of technological design, but it went beyond that. It went into the realm of nuclear signaling as well. And the confidence in deterrence. For example, if a country says it has nuclear weapons but has not demonstrated the capability, the signal to your adversaries don't go. They may still be in doubt. That was our debate in 1998. That if we don't, there will be always the doubt whether you really have it or not. But the moment you demonstrated that you have the capability, it works. Then one part of the equation, the capability was done. The other part is the will and resolve to use it. What this has done is that it is now drawing more lessons. So one part of the lesson is that if you look in purely as an arms control thing, that the constraint and the voluntarily moratorium, etc., that was exercised by the India and Pakistan in 1998 may erode. Now, that's the one pure reasons. And by the way, even before all this happened, one of the scholars, Ashley Tellis in US, in Indian origin scholar, he advocated the case that India should be allowed to do testing so as to be a sort of a peer competitor or parity with China. He made the case much before even Russia will do that. So that is an indication that there was, even without Russia's de-ratification, there was a push for India to improve its arsenals. You know that Chinese are also now improving their arsenals, given the cascading effect that we talked about, the geopolitics affects that. So that means that we are now losing that. I would say, even though the treaty was not ratified and treaty was not entered into force, but there was still norm. Normatively, the treaty was effectively, even if it was not effectively de jure. Only North Korea defied and moved out from the NPT and CTBT, and they said, I'm going ahead. But other than that, everyone else has held on to that. So that norm will break. So that's one part of that relating to the future of arms control as it evolved in the 20th century. Because now arms control may be in emerging technologies, AIs and UAVs and multi-domain deterrence, and so on and so forth. But this indication, because it's happening in the midst of the war, may give another second part, not just the arms control, but actually a use of nuclear weapons may not be directly in the battlefield or in Ukraine crisis, but maybe a demonstration rather than simple test, so as to indicate deterrence or deterrent signaling or indicating that they're going to use if the tipping point comes. And that's the other, gets into a bigger question, what are the pathways to possible nuclear use either in Russia or NATO or other places in the world? But this development is clearly an indication that both possibilities have opened up now. And from a Pakistani standpoint, the very fact that somebody advocated about India is number one, that India needs to test with or without this. India was being prepared for defiance of the global norm of CTBT. But Russia has now taken the lead of de-ratification. It does not augur well for arms control and both the nature of crisis in Ukraine.
Or do you think it will have any bearing on South Asian politics?
Yeah, so that sets a precedence. If India tests, I can guarantee you that Pakistan will follow suit.
All right.
I mean, that's purely by the history of logic. It is different that Pakistan may decide not by what decision, what factors will go in the ultimate decision. I can't foretell, but I'm just going by the practice that if that happens. Because India Pakistan only conducted those tests in 1998, India is going to 74, but those tests, given the history of testing, were not sufficient to do so. Now, the kind of simplified fission devices and simplified booster devices, you don't need really to do tests now because the technology has moved there. But if India has ambitions of thermonuclear weapons testing, then clearly they would need to do testing. Because if that's what they're looking for, then again, the political objective of competing at the system level. Do you really need that in the Pakistan? You would calculate what is in their national interest, then they may decide not to do so. The other argument is that there are certain compact designs which are very, very compact. You have them in your arsenals, the diameter of your paraded weapon systems that you see on 23rd March parade. Your shortest weapon system's diameter is about 11.8 inches, less than 1/4 diameter. To put an implosion design in that, it's a feat of technology for Pakistan to have produced that. And it must have gone through the computer simulation or cold test at best in order for that. It's not been hot tested. So if an opportunity arises, and I'm quite sure the scientific community will push that we need to validate the design, how it functions, how the chain reaction, how the implosion really happens, what's the impact happening, 1 kg, 2 kg. You would want to do that because that will give more confidence to it is now more militarily deliverable than scientifically proven with computer science. To me, that gives a bigger signal, both to the adversary and the confidence to the deliverer, to users. I mean, this is because so many tests have been done by other powers in the country. So if that norm is set by Russia, it doesn't augur well for India and Pakistan. So they may follow suit. You know. And very worse is that India Pakistan is so prone to crisis that happens so suddenly. And many other advocates, again of Indian origin advocates in USA, are still talking about that. You're reading too much into nuclear deterrence. I think the conventional war feasibility is more, technology is allowing. India doesn't care about international reputation anymore. India, what happened in Balakot and etc. India is now prepared to really escalate in the next crisis without fear of nuclear deterrence. These are the, you know, publications and these are the advocacies already starting there. Well, if Russia demonstrate that to have a demonstration in Ukraine war that I am now at the brink of, you cross my red line and I'm at the brink and demonstrates that, that means the South Asia will mimic that. In future crisis, if India pushes escalation of Western forces, then you don't be surprised that Pakistan may be looking for different options, even if they don't use directly. That may set a bad precedence. Like I said, international system, the big power, the big in great power competition, the big power set the precedence. Regional countries are a subset of international systems that they usually might mimic that system. So all in all, the implication for South Asia, given the very, very virulent nature of India-Pakistan tense relations with no prospects of dialogue or any process happening as we speak now, would indicate that any lessons drawn from the Ukraine war will not be a good lesson for the people of the subcontinent. So they remain adrift, as I write in my book. So that's my.
Thank you so much, Feroz Saab, for agreeing to appear in for this discussion on a very short notice. We learned a lot from your insights. For those of you who are watching this video, you can follow us on our social media pages. We regularly update our publications over there, and you can continue to follow us on YouTube as well. Thank you so much for watching.